Classification of sedimentary rocks, video 1. This video deals with the overall classification of sedimentary rocks and then looks in more detail at clastic rocks. We'll also be dealing with the work on describing the texture of sedimentary rocks. Now, a reminder that sedimentary rocks are deposited in layers. The next little video extract will show you a sequence of layers that were formed in Yorkshire.
Different parts of the park have different surface rocks. Why is this? 350 million years ago, it was under a warm, clear tropical ocean. Skeletons of sea creatures collected in the bottom in layers. The sea became shallow and silty mud was laid down. Under its weight, the sediments were squeezed into limestone that cracked into vertical joints. Later, rivers washed sand into the sea. The mud hardened into shales, the sand into grit and sandstones. Then layers of younger rock built up on top. Earth movements cracked the whole crust along fault lines, and all this time erosion was shaping an undulating surface. Then in the last few million years, great ice sheets scraped away at the landscape. As they melted, they left sharpened peaks in some places and bare limestone in others. And the meltwater continued to run off over the fault line, cutting deep coves and gorges.
Now, sedimentary rocks can be classified according to their mode of origin. That means where they were formed and how they were formed. The three main types are clastic or physical, formed from the mechanical breakdown of rock, where rock is then lithified. Biological or organic processes, such as the death of small fine sea creatures which then descend to the floor, which are lithified, i.e. limestone or chalk. And finally, those type of sedimentary rocks which are formed from the chemical precipitation of water, often associated with rock salt, as it's called halite. It's worth memorizing or certainly learning this diagram to make sure that you're not fumbling around in an exam trying to remember what each of them are. So clastic rocks come from the fact that it comes from the Greek meaning broken. Clastic rocks are the accumulation of weathered and eroded fragments of older pre-existing rocks. The main definition of these clastic rocks are, first of all, if the average grain size is over 2 millimeters, then it's regarded as coarse. If the size is between 1/16 and 2 millimeters, we describe it as medium. And finally, if we can't see the individual clasts to the naked eye, we regard that as fine-grained clastic rocks. When we're looking at the texture of sedimentary rocks, remember we can describe the degree of sorting. So here we can see in the first diagram that the deposits to class are very well sorted, indicating that they're being transported over a long distance. You can see the class sizes are generally the same, some bigger than others, but also quite spherical and well rounded as well. This diagram here, you can see there's different sizes as well. So we got it as well sorted. This one here, you can see there's moderately sorted, and the final two poorly sorted and very poorly sorted there. We can also describe the textural and mineralogical maturity of a sedimentary rock. So a rock is mature, a sedimentary rock is mature if it's undergone extensive or long distance transport and erosion. We normally associate that with very well sorted rocks, mineralogically the same type. Now remember about the relationship between quartz and feldspar, which we dealt with in the weathering video. But also an immature sediment is normally poorly sorted. It has class, as we said, of different sizes, lots of different mineralogies, and it's undergone normally rapid deposition over short distances. So it's only had a slight bit of erosion. We can also describe the shape in terms of the texture of a sedimentary rock. So here we can see from one extreme these very angular clasts to the well-rounded clasts here. Above, it talks about sphericity as well. So even though this particle is well rounded, this is spherical, and this is not particularly spherical, i.e. like a sphere. However, there is one problem when we use this observation. It is subjective. So one person's rounded might be someone else's subangular. So be wary of that when we're describing the texture of sedimentary rocks. The other part of texture we have to look at is whether it is matrix or cement supported. Now, remember we used the marbles in a jar analogy. There you see some individual grains which have been laid down. Now, water will circulate between those grains after they're being laid down, but notice the grains are touching, they're supporting their own weight. But after the water has circulated around over a long time, it precipitates, it deposits other minerals that cement the individual clasts together. So we call that cement. The rocks are cemented, okay, or class supported. Matrix, well, really that's when we have the rapid deposition and the particles are deposited at the same time as the finer material. And as you can see from these individual clasts, the larger class, they're not touching. So we call that matrix supported. And that's often associated with rapid deposition where the larger and the finer clasts are all deposited at the same time. Okay, so let's have a look at the individual groups of clastic rocks. So first of all, we have the coarse grain rocks, and we should know conglomerate and breccia. Now here's a conglomerate, you can hopefully see that straight away. The size of the particles themselves are well over 1 centimetre. What makes it a conglomerate? Well, the fact that they have very rounded, large clasts within there. This type of conglomerate is typical of a high energy environment such as beach material. That would explain why the individual particles are rounded. It is texturally mature because they are well-rounded clasts. And when we compare that to a breccia, we'll first of all have a look at this diagram. You can see that the individual clasts are much more angular. They're well over 1 centimetre. They're poorly sorted as well. The red colour often associated with breccia is the iron oxide cement between the individual clasts. We can describe this breccia as texturally immature. Remember, because it's only been transported a short distance, it has clasts of different sizes, and it's poorly sorted. It's matrix supported, and we associate this breccia with flash flooding in a desert environment. The rocks weren't carried very far, but they were rapidly deposited. Okay, let's have a look at the medium grain clastic sedimentary rocks. The overall name we give to these rocks are sandstones, and the three you need to know are orthoquartzite, greywacke, and arkose. Now remember how we identify or we separate those three. First of all, orthoquartzite. Orthoquartzite, as you can see there, is very well sorted. Remember, if we're describing the texture, we wouldn't use the percentage of quartz in it necessarily, because that would be a mineralogical description, that would be almost a chemical description. But they're very well sorted, very well rounded, and you can see the particles themselves, mainly made of quartz, are well rounded. Arkose. Well, the distinguishing feature for arkose is the presence of feldspar. So feldspar, if it's over 25%, it would represent an arkose. And finally, the other one of the sandstones is one called greywacke. Greywacke is distinguished between the high matrix support. Now this is a greywacke here. As you can see, we do have some large class within it. But we associate greywacke with turbidite currents, and I've got a short video attached to this in a minute. What else can we say about this greywacke? Mainly it's composed of mud because it formed from the undersea avalanche of sea sediment. So that accounts for the high percentage of muddy matrix, the clay minerals within. There's often fining upwards. Now, graded bedding is a way of identifying overturned structures. But graded bedding is also associated with greywacke sandstone. The clasts are generally angular, between 2 to 6 millimeters. And we can describe this turbidite sandstone, this grey-wacky sandstone, as texturally immature. This extract from the laboratory shows a turbidity current. The slope represents the continental shelf. The turbidity current is caused by the dislodged material from the continental shelf. Now, where are turbidite currents most common? Well, from this little map here, you can see the continental shelf. That's the dividing line between the continental plate and the oceanic plate. And it's quite a steep drop, normally over a steep gradient of about 1 in 5 over a distance of about 100 miles. So you can see there, it's quite an extensive shelf there. Now, on the shelf, on the top of the shelf, are loads of sediment deposited from the sea and also rivers. And it hangs there like snow on steep mountains very loosely. It can be disturbed, and when it is disturbed, it produces these turbidity currents. And these are associated with grey-wackies. And here's an example of 3 successive turbidite currents producing this graded bedding. You can see that the larger class are at the bottom, which were deposited first as the turbidity current settled, and the finer class were deposited on top of that. So that represents 1, 2, 3 different underwater turbidity currents. Okay, arcos we associate with hot desert areas, the mechanical weathering normally of granite under arid, that means very dry conditions. There's not much mica in there because mica breaks down into small flakes, very fine flakes that are blown away by the wind. Remember, the key defining feature is this feldspar. It is normally very texturally immature, as we see there. The pinkish purple colour is due to the high percentage of feldspar, but also the iron oxide cement associated with deserts. So that's the Arcos sandstone. Here we see an orthoquartzite, sometimes called a desert sandstone. You can probably see in this picture alone the individual quartz grains that make it up. Notice its reddish appearance. So what can we say about this? Well, it's associated with the wind-blown deposits, what we call aeolian deposits formed in hot desert areas. Remember that the wind can only pick up particles of a certain size. It will leave the heavier material behind, and so it sorts it out. It blows only the either the minute or the medium-grained sand into one particular place, so it's very well sorted. It can be described as texturally mature. The red staining comes from the fact that there's a high degree of iron oxide within the rock, so it gives you that red staining. Cross-bedding, remember, which is a sedimentary structure. We'll look at that on the sedimentary structure video, but it's often common in desert sandstones. The individual grains, again, you'll see it in a second, have a frosted appearance and sometimes a pitted appearance because of the constant bashing they get. And we can say as well as being a mature sediment texturally, we can also say that it's mineralogically mature because it's mainly quartz. Now, I mentioned that I'd show you a close-up, a microscopic view of desert sandstone, orthoquartzite sandstone. This probably has a few more versions of quartz than most desert sandstones. But you can see the frosted appearance. This individual quartz grain here, for instance, is translucent, that light can get through it, but it's not transparent. That means it's been bashed around a lot, so it is a frosted appearance. On some of the grains there, you can see that the impact craters, that means it's been pitted. That's caused by the impact of grains as they're smashed into each other. In the next video, we'll look at fine-grained clastic rocks, organic rocks and chemical precipitates.